Chapter 1 News of Thomas Lane's injury had spread. He had been training with his father for many years, and on his way back to the capital, he saved the princess. Everyone said the princess fell in love with him at first sight. Rare and precious medicinal herbs were continuously sent to his residence, accompanied by subtle, probing words. Rumors reached my ears. They laughed and said, "Laura Smith, the man you like is about to fall for someone else." I didn't believe it, nor did I dare to. When I arrived, Thomas Lane was playing with the scented pouch gifted by the princess in his hand. A visiting friend teased him with a smile, "You've accepted the princess's kindness so openly, aren't you afraid the young lady of the Shu family will get jealous and cause a scene?" Thomas Lane's fingers paused. After a moment, he pulled out a jade pendant from within his robes. With a weary expression, he replied dismissively, "My brother will help me deal with her." The jade pendant was carelessly tossed into the pond outside the window, sinking silently, without a trace. There wasn't the slightest hint of regret in his actions. He was a proud and free-spirited young man who had never liked being tied down since childhood. And so, he didn't like girls like me either. That jade pendant had been with Thomas Lane for a very long time. Back then, when he went to war with his father, he was poisoned and on the brink of death. Even Dr. James had sighed and said he wouldn't survive more than 3 days. In such a desperate situation, I had no choice but to believe in the supernatural legends passed down by the people. Step by step, bowing my head with every move, from dawn till dusk. The mountain path was rugged and uneven, and even the maid beside me wept until her eyes turned red. I bit my lip, refusing to let out a single word of pain. I knelt before the gods and prayed. I prayed for Thomas Lane to live a long life, to live longer, even longer still. Please grant Thomas Lane peace and prosperity. I bowed until my forehead bled, my body covered in wounds, and in exchange, I obtained this jade pendant. The next day, Thomas Lane's fever subsided. I fell asleep by his bedside. When I woke up, I found the jade pendant already in his hand. He looked at me carefully, then leaned over and gently wiped away the tears from my face. That jade pendant became his talisman. During the years of war, he never once encountered dangers like those of that year. Now, he has casually thrown that jade pendant away. The capital is abuzz with gossip, teasing that he has caught the attention of a princess. A life-saving bond, a fated connection, such tales make for a beautiful story. I vaguely recall. Back then, he kept the jade pendant close to his chest. In the dim morning light, he smiled and said, "Miss Allen, do you like me?" But he has long since forgotten. I fled in a panic. I have loved Thomas Lane for so long, loved him so deeply that everyone knew. Loved him to the point where my body bore countless scars, and people mocked me, saying the Shu family had a lovesick daughter. When I was young, my father and elder brother passed away early. I was left to be raised by my uncle and Aunt Mary. In their quest to seize the family inheritance quickly, Aunt Mary did everything she could to marry me off. That year, when I came of age, I was betrothed to a man from Aunt Mary's family. She claimed the old man would cherish me and ensure I wouldn't suffer. I cried and pleaded that I didn't want to marry him. Everyone knew the old man was over 70, with a house full of concubines, and took delight in tormenting others. To force me into submission, the two of them locked me in the storage room and fed me medicine to weaken my body. I cried until my voice was hoarse, but no one cared. Until Thomas Lane appeared. He held my shoulder, fighting alone against dozens of servants in the rain, coldly saying, "I want to see who dares to touch her." He said that between me and Laura Smith, although it was just a verbal promise from the elders, we once had a marriage agreement when we were young. If Alan doesn't mind, then from now until the end of my life, all of my possessions, Thomas Lane's entire fortune, will be yours. A promise neither too heavy nor too light, but it protected me for many years. Yet I had forgotten. Promises like that could never be counted on. But I didn't expect everything to come so quickly. After returning to the Smith family, I was imprisoned by Aunt Mary, locked up in the secluded estate. She held my birth chart, with a bright red wedding dress laid out in front of her. She advised me, "I know you find that uncle too old, but if you marry him for a few years and wait for him to die, you can enjoy the good days ahead." What's so bad about that? It's bad. Everything about it is bad. My father and brother sacrificed their lives on the battlefield, and after their deaths, they were honored. Everything they left behind fell into my hands. Such a vast fortune, tempting enough to make people greedy. How could I watch the wealth that my father and brother gave their lives for become someone else's dowry? Aunt Mary stopped persuading me, only mentioning that in 2 days, it would be the princess's birthday, and Thomas Lane would also be attending. Anyone with insight knew this was an opportunity for the emperor to choose a consort for the princess. Before leaving, she said, "Laura Smith, Thomas Lane used to protect you, but he never truly exchanged birth charts with you or set a formal engagement. Everyone says that hearts change easily over time. It's been so many years. You should accept your fate." I stubbornly pressed my lips together, wiping away tears with the back of my hand, but I knew deep down I couldn't argue. Because even I couldn't explain it. Thomas Lane, if he truly cared for me, then why had he never thought of coming to my house to formally ask for my hand? Chapter 2. I changed into a servant's attire and escaped from the Thursday family estate. I wanted to find Thomas Lane. I didn't expect him to keep his promises, didn't demand that he marry me, even if he lived happily with the princess, that would be fine. I just wanted to plead for his help. I begged him to help me, to prevent me from being married off to someone I didn't want to marry. I deliberately left very early. I knew Thomas Lane would attend a banquet at the palace, so I arrived early to wait at his residence's entrance. But today, the Ta family household was bustling, and it was quite difficult for me to locate Thomas Lane's trusted servant. With a pleading expression, I told the servant that I had something very urgent to discuss with Thomas Lane. But I waited for a long time, waited until dawn, trying to muster my strength, only to receive a reply after the servant delivered my message. "The young master says the Ta family is hosting an esteemed guest today. He asks that the lady return for now, and he will speak with you another day." I heard footsteps from the doorway, saw the princess stepping out with a radiant smile, and Thomas Lane following behind alongside Master Ta. When he saw me, Thomas Lane's gaze lingered for a moment but eventually shifted away. So, the esteemed guest of the Ta family was the princess. I lowered my head to look at the rough clothes I was wearing. I had never felt so disheveled and humiliated. To escape from the Thursday family, I had gritted my teeth and climbed onto the roof. When I closed my eyes and jumped down, my heart trembled, and my arm was scratched and bleeding from a branch. At that moment, I truly wanted to cry. I was already in such a pitiful state, so desperate, yet Thomas Lane didn't even ask me a single question. The carriage headed toward the palace, guarded by numerous imperial guards, making it impossible for me to approach. The family servants who discovered my escape had caught up to me. I saw the lanterns hanging in front of the estate extinguished because dawn had arrived. Yet, why did the daylight feel so blinding? I clenched my palms, holding back tears of pain, turned around, and prepared to run again. The servants chasing me were suddenly stopped, and in front of me stood a tall, slender figure. The hem of his black robe fluttered in the wind. I stared at him in a daze, only hearing him softly ask, "Does it have to be Thomas Lane?" I hadn't expected to encounter Victor Lane here. Victor Lane was a member of the Ta family, but he was also one of the rare outstanding individuals among them. In a way, our backgrounds were somewhat similar. We were both orphans, relying on others for survival. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I quickly wiped them away. I told Victor Lane, "I don't want to go back to the Thursday family. That place was not my home." Thomas Lane discarded my jade pendant and told his friends that Victor Lane would deal with me. "So Victor Lane, can you not leave me here?" Victor Lane lowered his head, looking at me for a moment, his voice very soft, "All right." The ferocious servants were easily subdued. I sat in Victor Lane's carriage, drenched in sweat, even my palms were clammy with fear. He had established his own residence long ago. Over the years, he had risen too quickly, and his title as the emperor's close confidant made others cautious around him. But there were exceptions. Aunt Mary, whom I came to visit, was here to take me away. She acted nonchalant, smiling as she said I was being too stubborn because I didn't want to marry the suitor. She also claimed that staying in the Ta family residence was inappropriate. Victor Lane listened quietly, sipping a cup of tea. The rising steam blurred his brows and eyes. He asked, "Do you have the 8 characters of birth?" Aunt Mary, sensing his willingness to compromise, smiled and handed over the birth chart. Victor Lane flipped it back and forth, then tossed the old man's birth chart into the candle flame. The fire flared up quickly, reducing it to ashes. In moments. Seeing Aunt Mary hastily trying to stop him, he spoke slowly, "The dead have no need to discuss marriage." Soon after, servants from the Smith household rushed in, whispering a few words into Aunt Mary's ear. That old man had died in the bed of his concubine. Aunt Mary spilled her tea, gasping as she lunged at me, but the household servants pulled her out of the residence. Victor Lane slightly raised an eyelid and tucked my birth chart into his sleeve. "I will keep this birth chart." His smile was gentle, but his tone was firm and uncompromising. The warmth of the tea dissipated. It was only then that I noticed a small mole at the corner of his eye. This matter eventually reached the emperor. It was said that civil and military officials submitted petitions accusing Victor Lane of arrogance and disregard for human life. Officials and censors knelt in the palace for hours, pleading for strict punishment against Victor Lane. By the time I received the news, it was late at night. I stood outside the palace gates, anxiously waiting. This incident was caused by me, and I feared Victor Lane would be affected, demoted, or harmed because of it. But unexpectedly, the first person I saw was Thomas Lane. He was escorting the princess's carriage, riding a horse down the street in the dark. For the first time I hated my sharp eyesight. The princess leaned out of the window, smiling brightly as she handed him a piece of cake. Thomas Lane seemed indifferent but still accepted it, eating it all patiently. I suddenly remembered that today is the princess's birthday. Thomas Lane went out with the princess, guarding her wholeheartedly along the way. And what about me? What am I to Thomas Lane? At that moment, countless thoughts flooded my mind. Thomas Lane doesn't like eating water caltrops, he says they're cold. So, on his birthday that year, I secretly left the manor to pick water caltrops from the lake, but he didn't touch them at all. Just like today, he knew I was worried, knew I was in a difficult position, yet he still let me go so easily. In truth, it's not that Thomas Lane didn't care, it's just that the fault lies elsewhere. The fault lies with the Shu family. The fault lies with me. The childhood affection we once shared has long faded. I've been living under someone else's roof, unable to remain proud or headstrong. I've had to smooth out my edges, turning into the gentle and obedient young lady of the Shu family. And so, Thomas Lane found someone more suitable. I clenched my palms tightly, feeling something warm fall onto them. I stared at the teardrops on the back of my hand for a long time, staring until my eyes stung, and finally lowered my head. The palace gates were so grand, and in this narrow encounter, Thomas Lane still noticed me. He said something to the princess in the carriage, then dismounted and walked toward me. Frowning, he asked, "What are you doing here?" The princess's carriage stopped just outside the palace gates. The high-hanging lanterns illuminated his face. I looked into those familiar eyes and brows, with so many words to say but unable to utter them. Instead, I simply asked, "Thomas Lane, where is the jade pendant I gave you?" Thomas Lane froze. He pressed his lips together, his gaze slightly evasive, and replied, "At home. I forgot to bring it today." I nodded indifferently. I didn't want to expose his lie. In truth, the signs had been there all along, I just didn't want to acknowledge them. I had to run headfirst into the southern wall, before I could stop myself. He softened his tone, "Go home first. I'll come find you after leaving the palace." Thomas Lane turned and walked back toward the carriage. I watched his retreating figure, but all I could feel was unfamiliarity. I spoke to his back, "Don't worry. I won't cling to you anymore." In his puzzled gaze, I smiled and wiped the tears from the corners of my eyes. I smiled and said, "The princess is waiting for you. Go quickly. From now on, we'll each walk our own paths. I no longer want to search for, nor love, Thomas Lane. I can no longer stay at the palace gates. I don't want to see Thomas Lane when he leaves the palace, nor do I want to return home." In the end, I follow the old path and find myself once again in front of Victor Lane's residence. The news of his demotion has already spread, banished to Jingzhou, with no set date for his return. On my way here, I considered many outcomes. If the emperor demands Victor Lane's life, I would exchange mine for his. If he is reprimanded and demoted, no matter how arduous the journey, I would give my life to accompany him. What I have is not much. I've lost my parents, the ones who cherished me like a treasure, and I've lost the man who once risked everything to protect me. Precisely because what I have is so little, I understand the immeasurable value of it. I can no longer hurt those who are kind to me. In the cold dew of the late night, I hear the soft sound of horse hooves. I lift my head from my arms and faintly see someone leading a horse under the moonlight in the distance. He holds the reins, walking slowly step by step, yet each step is steady. He ascends the stairs and finally stands before me. Victor Lane doesn't ask anything. He extends his hand to pull me up from where I'm sitting on the ground, finds clothes to keep me warm, and when his fingers touch my cold ones, he pauses for a moment and simply says, "The night is cold. Next time, you can come straight inside." At first, I didn't want to cry. But in the end, I couldn't hold back. I choked out, "I'm sorry. Sorry for dragging him into this." Victor Lane lifts his head, tilting my chin under the moonlight. His gaze is calm, his breath close. He lowers his eyes slightly and carefully wipes away my tears. "This punishment of being sent to Jingzhou is because the emperor wants me to secretly investigate the embezzlement of relief funds. The matter with the Smith family is just an excuse. Even if it wasn't the Smith family, it would have been the Wang family or the Li family." He speaks each word deliberately. Chapter 3. Don't overthink it. I followed Victor Lane to Jingzhou. It was my decision to go. I told Victor Lane that I wanted to see Jingzhou for myself. Perhaps it was out of lingering guilt, or perhaps I simply didn't want to face Thomas Lane anymore, or maybe it was both. But that no longer mattered. Suddenly, an epidemic broke out in Jingzhou. Initially, the emperor had only ordered Victor Lane to provide flood relief, but no one expected the floodwaters to carry corpses, leading to the outbreak of disease. Victor Lane immediately wanted to take me back to the capital. Jingzhou was already within sight, separated only by the city walls, and its people were in dire straits. I interrupted the servant who was packing our belongings. For the first time I mustered all my courage to stand before Victor Lane. "I want to go to Jingzhou." There was no reason to flee at this moment. My father and brother never backed down in the face of swords and blades. Victor Lane didn't hesitate upon learning of the epidemic. I am a woman. But I don't think that makes me any different from them. Should I return to the capital, seek my husband, and fight life and death battles with Aunt Mary, is that what's right? I looked directly into Victor Lane's eyes and said seriously, "If everyone runs away, then one day, the winds carrying the plague will blow into the capital. It's just a matter of dying sooner or later. Or do you insist on driving me away?" Seeing Victor Lane lower his head in silence, I was about to speak when I noticed him clenching his fists and saying, "I understand." He took a step toward me, shielding me from the cold wind, then gently pushed me into the carriage. His robe fluttered in the wind. "I never intended to drive you away." I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination, but his next words seemed to dissolve softly into the breeze. "I'm only worried about you." I became busy. The epidemic originated from the flood. Although it was discovered in time, many people in the city still fell ill. Victor Lane drew up plans for digging drainage canals. He ordered the isolation of the sick, the burning of the deceased's clothing, and the use of mugwort smoke throughout the city to prevent the spread of disease. The gates of Jingzhou were tightly shut, entry was allowed, but no one could leave. I spent a few days learning from Dr. James in the epidemic zone, then began preparing and distributing medicine to those infected. I was busy for several days straight. If not for Victor Lane insisting I return to the manor daily, I might have collapsed from exhaustion and stayed there. Fortunately, the epidemic was caught early, and efforts to manage both the flood and the disease were carried out simultaneously, preventing further spread. I handed medicine to a sick child whose entire family had succumbed to the illness, leaving him alone. The child cried until his eyes were swollen. Although his hands were so weak they could barely lift, he still clung tightly to my sleeve, sobbing, "Big sister, I want to see my father and mother." After much effort, I managed to get him to drink the medicine. Then I heard a faint sound behind me. Turning around, I saw Victor Lane standing silently under the eaves, bathed in the moonlight. He had come to take me back to the manor. He handed me a warm bowl of medicine, then carefully smoked my clothes with mugwort. Even people within the city sometimes advised me to stay away from the epidemic zone, but Victor Lane never did. Later, I asked Victor Lane why he never urged me to avoid the disease-stricken area like everyone else did. He said that once he made up his mind, his advice and objections would only make me more uneasy and were completely meaningless. It was better to keep me under his watchful eye and take precautions. On the way back to the manor, I thought for a moment and then said to Victor Lane, "Actually, you don't need to come and pick me up every day." Victor Lane replied briefly, "It's on the way." I knew it wasn't on the way at all. Victor Lane had to manage flood control and disease prevention, running around tirelessly. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, though he never mentioned it himself. I quickened my pace, walking a few steps ahead of him, then turned around to face him. Looking into his eyes, I smiled and said, "Victor Lane, you know what? At first, I was really afraid of you." Victor Lane's expression didn't change, but his eyelashes trembled slightly. "Really?" I tilted my head to look at the moon behind him. In this ruined Jingzhou, the moon remained full and bright. "Yeah. When we were younger, you were always cold and distant. Back then, you weren't close to anyone. Later, when I heard you had become one of the emperor's trusted officials, everyone said you were ruthless and unfeeling. Your fearsome reputation spread far and wide. Every time I saw you, I couldn't help but recall those blood-curdling rumors, and I was so scared I'd tremble." Victor Lane remained silent. Receiving no response from him, I shifted my gaze from the moon to his eyes. It was only then I realized that Victor Lane had been looking at me intently all along. I was momentarily distracted, stepped back, and accidentally tripped on a stone, nearly falling. Victor Lane grabbed my wrist. My heart skipped a beat. I instinctively pulled my hand back, stood still, and looked into his eyes, where the gentle moonlight reflected. Unable to hold back, I asked, "Aren't you curious whether I'm still afraid of you now?" Victor Lane patiently asked, "And now?" I stood on tiptoe, plucked a small leaf from his hair, smiled, and shook my head. "Not anymore. Someone cold on the outside but warm on the inside isn't scary at all." The flooding in the city had been brought under control. The city had been sealed off for nearly a month, and medical supplies were running out. If the epidemic flared up again due to the lack of medicine, all efforts would be in vain. The medicine had been boiled repeatedly, its potency diminishing, but it was the best we could manage for now. I don't know when the imperial court will send aid. In this harsh environment, Victor Lane and I have grown to understand each other more deeply. He waits for me under the eaves, ensuring I take the epidemic prevention medicine 3 times a day, always wanting to see me finish it with his own eyes. Sometimes, we even run into each other by chance on the streets. We've become so busy that we can't be apart, a single glance is enough to understand each other's thoughts. Occasionally, he brings me a sweet water chestnut. The city gate rumbles, from afar, the sound of hoofbeats echoes. I hear someone cry out in joy, their voice trembling with relief, the medicine has arrived. I breathe a sigh of relief. Swallowing the last piece of water chestnut, I watch as the horse's hooves stir up clouds of dust. Crates of medicine are delivered into Jingzhou. Dr. James and I distribute the epidemic prevention medicine to the guards escorting the supplies. From a distance, I hear a loud shout. Someone pushes through the crowd, "Move aside." The familiar voice stuns me. Before I can turn around, someone grabs my wrist. Thomas Lane pulls me out of the crowd, and the bowl of medicine in my hands falls to the ground, shattering. His grip on my wrist is so tight it hurts, and I frown in discomfort. He drags me toward the city gate, his fingers brushing the corner of his lips as he lets out a sharp whistle. A red-maned horse charges through the crowd, stopping beside us. The city gate has already been closed. Gripping his long sword, he shouts at the gate guards, "Open the gate." Thomas Lane mounts the horse, leaning down to extend a hand toward me. But instinctively, I take a step back. This time, I truly see the surprise in Thomas Lane's eyes. He looks utterly disheveled, the dark circles under his eyes unmistakable. Who knows how many days he's rushed without rest to reach Jingzhou. I avoid his hand, meeting his pained gaze, and say, "Don't be foolish, Thomas Lane." I press my lips together. None of us can leave. Jingzhou is sealed, no one can enter or leave. No one can bear the responsibility if the epidemic spreads beyond these walls. Neither the Smith family nor the Ta family could withstand the consequences. So I cannot understand why Thomas Lane came to Jingzhou. How could his father have allowed him to come here? Thomas Lane unexpectedly closes his eyes. When he opens them again, there's a hint of redness at the corners. "Laura Smith, stop being so stubborn." His voice is soft but urgent. "If something happens to you, how am I supposed to face your father and brother?" I cut him off, no need to explain. I looked straight into his eyes, speaking each word clearly. "You knew there was an epidemic, yet you still decided to go to Jingzhou. That was my choice. We were never engaged. I thank you for your concern for me, stemming from our childhood bond. But if anything happens to me in Jingzhou, there's no need for you to explain to my father or elder brother." Thomas Lane said nothing more. He looked at me for a while, then spoke in a low voice. "I know you left the capital because of the misunderstanding between me and the princess. But she and I—" "Alan." Someone interrupted Thomas Lane. I knew it was Victor Lane, who brought a warm bowl of medicine to me. I heard him say, "Drink the medicine first." I looked at the dark, murky liquid, swallowing it without hesitation. The bitterness spread from my throat, but over time, it became something I could bear. Just like me and Thomas Lane. I wiped the medicine stain from the corner of my mouth with indifference. In the midst of Thomas Lane's pained gaze, I said, "I don't care. I don't care about his relationship with the princess." Chapter 4. Thomas Lane stayed in Jingzhou. 2 months passed, and the epidemic in Jingzhou had subsided. Sometimes, Thomas Lane would stay by my side. When brewing medicine, he would hand me water. When measuring doses, he would pass me the bowl. When distributing medicine, he would not let me get too close to the patients, standing in front of me and taking care of everything himself. The epidemic was under control, and the people in the city focused their efforts on rebuilding Jingzhou, but I always felt that something was amiss. It was too easy. Decades ago, the southern Liang region also suffered from an epidemic, causing many deaths and affecting several cities. Although the outbreak in Jingzhou was discovered early, it didn't spread widely. The fatalities were almost exclusively among the poor in the affected areas, and the number of infected individuals was surprisingly low. Moreover, Jingzhou had also been hit by floods. No matter how effective the medicine might be, it shouldn't have achieved such results. I carried a food box and stood by the riverbank, patiently watching Victor Lane work alongside the townsfolk to build a dam in the river. Until Victor Lane noticed me. He turned to say something to the person next to him, then waded upstream, toward me. Standing in the rushing water, he looked up at me from below. His hair was already wet, and as he raised his gaze, the small mole near the corner of his eye seemed to come alive. I raised the food box in my hand and said, "Master Victor, I brought you something to eat." I shared my suspicions with Victor Lane. I speculated that the situation in Jingzhou might not have been an epidemic but rather poisoning. Before I could finish, Victor Lane stopped me. A piece of candy was popped into my mouth, dissolving the bitter taste of the medicine. Although the epidemic had ended, to prevent a recurrence, the townspeople still had to take preventive medicine daily. I listened as Victor Lane spoke. Qin Chao is surrounded by water, so building dikes is a common practice. However, no one has ever proposed digging canals to redirect the water. When constructing the dikes, we reviewed documents from years past and found their quality to be poor. That's why Qin Chao faces flooding every year. I can't help but recall that night when I waited at the gate of the Xia family estate. Victor Lane had told me that his assignment to Qin Chao was the Emperor's secret order for him to investigate something. So, was this the matter Victor Lane was investigating? A water caltrop drifted downstream. Everyone knew that Victor Lane never accepted fruits from the people, except for water caltrops. He picked up the water caltrop, smiled, and nodded in gratitude to the upstream villagers. The water caltrop, wet and translucent, looked fresh and appetizing. He opened his palm and held the water caltrop out to me. "The next steps will be very dangerous," he said, looking into my eyes. "Let me handle it." I said nothing, taking the water caltrop from him. I clenched it tightly in my hand and gazed at the distant sky. The epidemic had subsided, the flooding was under control, and life in Qin Chao was gradually improving. But suddenly, I had an urge to ask Victor Lane a question. "Master Xia, do you like water caltrops?" "Why was that?" Victor Lane refused all other fruits offered by the people, yet he never declined water caltrops. It was a secret everyone seemed to know. I didn't want to overthink it. Nor did I want to jump to conclusions. Whether it was taking a detour every day to meet me or checking 3 times daily to ensure I took my medicine, I had to ask him directly. Victor Lane's voice became steady. "It's not that I like water caltrops." I was momentarily stunned, lowering my gaze. Even the tips of my fingers curled slightly in embarrassment. As expected, I had overthought it. But then, I heard Victor Lane speak again, his voice carrying a smile. "It's just because of its name. To love someone is to love everything about them, even the paths they walk. That's all." I didn't know what Victor Lane had done. He wanted me not to worry about the flooding or the poisoning incidents and urged me to protect myself. But he himself was taking all the risks. After that day, Victor Lane submitted a memorial to the capital. The emperor's emotions remained unreadable, but he issued an order for him to return to the capital. However, none of us could leave Jingzhou. The governor of Jingzhou had sealed the city gates and led troops to surround the Ta family residence. I lifted my skirt and ran through the corridor, pushing open the door to Victor Lane's room, only to freeze in shock. Victor Lane, his expression unchanging, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. The wound on his side was deep, but he merely pressed his lips together, raising his arm to use his wide sleeve to cover it. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. I heard my voice tremble as I asked, "Victor Lane, are you all right?" He looked up, acting as though nothing had happened, and replied, "I'm fine. I've sent word to Thomas Lane, he will protect you. Don't be afraid." Outside the residence, the noise grew louder. The few servants guarding the gate were about to be overwhelmed. Blood flowed heavily from Victor Lane's deep wound, and there was no physician in the residence. My hands trembled as I tried to stop the bleeding, but it was futile. Gritting my teeth, I ran to the front hall. The gates of the residence were on the verge of being breached. There weren't many weapons in the house. I ordered the servants to find kerosene, but it wouldn't hold them off for long. Taking a deep breath, I instructed the servants to open the gates. The governor of Jingzhou, seeing the gates open, signaled his soldiers to lower their swords and smiled as he spoke. "Miss Smith, there was a break-in at the governor's residence today. Someone saw the thief escape into the Ta family residence." Please allow us to enter and capture the thief." I refused. Everyone understood this was merely an excuse to silence us. If they entered the residence, news of Victor Lane's death, supposedly assassinated by a sudden thief, would likely reach the capital by tomorrow. The governor, losing patience, raised his voice. "Miss Smith has no connection to the Ta family estate. Interfering in the matters of the Ta family is excessive. Guards, search the estate." Not entirely without connection. My eyes suddenly felt hot. At that moment, the sound of galloping horses echoed from the end of the street. It was Thomas Lane. Though his men were fewer than the city guards of Kin Chow, they resolutely stood outside the Ta family estate, locked in a tense standoff. I spoke each word clearly. "Victor Lane and I are not without a connection. He and I have a betrothal. Therefore, I have the right to make decisions regarding the Ta family estate. Victor Lane had once said he accepted my birth details. He simply hadn't had the chance to marry me yet." Thomas Lane gripped the reins tightly. The atmosphere grew heavy. The governor smiled as he addressed Thomas Lane, but the smile never reached his eyes. "Are you here to interfere as well?" The relief escort troops had withdrawn from Kin Chow a few days prior, leaving only the personal guards Thomas Lane brought from the Ta family estate. Against the city guards of Kin Chow, retreating safely was nearly impossible. Thomas Lane shook his head and pointed directly at me. "I'm only here to take her away." The governor stepped aside. Thomas Lane approached me and grabbed my wrist. I clutched Thomas Lane's hand tightly. "Victor Lane is your elder brother." A fleeting sadness crossed Thomas Lane's eyes before he gritted his teeth and said, "But I can't let him seize the opportunity to take my betrothed." My eyes stung with pain. Thomas Lane, he had never truly wanted to marry me. Why the pretense now? Amidst the tension, someone stepped out from the estate gates. The blood-stained garments had been changed. Apart from a slightly pale complexion, there was no sign of injury. Victor Lane stood at a distance, gazing at me through the line of soldiers. He said, "Alan, return to the capital." Chapter 5. I sat inside the carriage. Thomas Lane's voice drifted in through the window. "Half a month more, and we'll reach the capital." That day, Victor Lane coughed and returned the 8 characters of birth to me. He said the Smith family's assets, which Aunt Mary had taken from me, had been fully recovered. He told me he was only taking care of me on behalf of Thomas Lane for a while, like the saying, "Love me, love my dog." Now, returning the 8 characters, there was nothing left between us. So, there was no reason for me to stay. At that moment, I truly shed tears. I said nothing, turned around, and got into Thomas Lane's carriage. In truth, I could distinguish between lies and sincerity, just like the words Victor Lane spoke that day, meant only to make me leave. But I knew I had more important things to do. Victor Lane had uncovered evidence of the cruel crimes committed by the governor that led to the disaster in Jingzhou, and now the governor wanted to silence him. I wanted to return to the capital. I wiped my blurred eyes, brushing away the tears. But perhaps it would be too late. No one could protect the Smith household. The evidence of the governor's crimes would surely be destroyed before officials from the capital arrived. At that time, Victor Lane's death would only be dismissed as an accident. The capital was vast, and he had no parents. Many had already set their sights on taking his life. No one would seek justice for him. It was summer, a season of heavy rain. The river swelled, and the soil along its banks became slippery. The horse lost its footing, and the luggage on the carriage fell into the mud, delaying our journey. Someone suggested abandoning the useless items. Thomas Lane agreed. The belongings Victor Lane left for me were carelessly discarded. In truth, there wasn't much of value, just the 8 characters, a basket of water chestnuts, a few boxes of books, and nothing more. When the books were thrown into the rushing river, I pushed Thomas Lane aside and leapt after them. I choked on the river water several times, but I didn't care. I had learned how to read ledgers. I wasn't sure if I was mistaken, but I couldn't understand why the books Victor Lane left for me contained some accounting records. Why were there accounting records? The paper was soaked with water, and the writing had blurred. I held the ledger while standing in the freezing river, flipping through the pages quickly, my heart growing colder with every turn. The items Victor Lane brought out from the governor's residence that day were precisely these ledgers. The records were incomplete but documented the corruption during each year of the dike construction and flood control projects in Jingzhou. Thomas Lane also jumped into the water. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers trembling. He shouted, "Laura Smith, are these torn books worth risking your life for?" I slowly looked up, feeling only the tears streaming down my face. I saw Thomas Lane's lips pressed tightly together, his eyes filled with lingering regret and anguish. But I couldn't care about that. My entire body was shaking as I stood in front of everyone, panting, and said firmly, "They cannot be discarded." The governor of Jingzhou could not escape. The emperor flew into a rage and ordered a thorough investigation. These ledgers played a crucial role. A series of events exposed the epidemic in Jingzhou. It turned out that the governor of Jingzhou had colluded with foreign factions, planning to spread the epidemic to the capital to seize power. However, the floods in Jingzhou caused their plot to unravel prematurely. People said Victor Lane's body was never found. There was a great commotion that day, and it was rumored that Victor Lane was gravely injured. No one knew where he was or whether he was alive or dead. A former subordinate of Victor Lane came to deliver me a key. He said it was something Victor Lane had left behind, instructing it to be handed to me personally. I opened the storage room, and the thick dust made me cough violently. This was Victor Lane's entire fortune. The shops were managed by others, and he had no interest in gold, silver, or jewels. That day in Jingzhou, before I left, Victor Lane entrusted all his possessions to me. He said, "If you marry someday, I have nothing to offer as a gift. These trivial things are all I have left. I hope Alan doesn't find them unworthy." I just think that, even though Victor Lane left these things for me, one day I will have to return them. If he doesn't come back, I'll truly have to carry his entire fortune and give it to someone else. Victor Lane, would you be angry? If you don't want that, Victor Lane, then please come back soon. I've gone to Jingzhou. The capital no longer holds anything worth my attachment, I have no official position, and my comings and goings are entirely free. It was raining heavily. Before I left, Thomas Lane saw me off by the Qinghe Lake. With my father's help, the relief transport went smoothly. I heard he's been promoted quickly, showing the same demeanor Victor Lane once had. He stayed silent for a long time before finally saying, "Do you really have to leave?" Suddenly, I recalled that day when I clumsily climbed over the Smith family's wall, ragged and desperate, and someone swept away all the obstacles for me. That person asked, "Does it really have to be Thomas Lane?" I smiled. Yes, I really have to leave. I wanted to go to Jingzhou. In just a few short months, I felt freer than I ever did in the decades of my life before. Thomas Lane pulled out a jade pendant from his chest, the same one he had once thrown away. The pendant was still intact, perhaps because the mud at the bottom of the lake was too deep, or maybe it was just lucky not to hit any rocks. Thomas Lane's hoarse voice reached my ears, "The jade pendant, I've retrieved it." He said there was no affection between him and the princess. His father wanted him to approach the royal family to advance his position, and the princess herself had someone she wished to marry but couldn't. Both of them knew their relationship was merely an act. I patiently listened to him finish before unexpectedly speaking, "Thomas Lane, the issue between us has never been about someone else." Thomas Lane froze. I took the jade pendant from his hand, feeling its lingering warmth, as if it had been carefully and lovingly preserved by someone. But alas, time had passed. When something becomes routine, even treasures once held delicately for fear of breaking lose their value. Standing before him, I threw the jade pendant into the waters of Qinghe Lake. This jade pendant was something I had personally begged for, each step and bow filled with sincerity. Victor Lane still vividly remembered the panic when he learned Thomas Lane was in critical condition. So now, it was only fitting that I be the one to discard it. Thomas Lane instinctively reached out to catch it, but he was a moment too late. He stared at the pendant sinking into the water, the ripples it caused vanishing beneath the falling raindrops. I tilted my head to look at Thomas Lane. You're right. Your elder brother is more than capable of dealing with me. Thomas Lane stiffened. In a low voice, he said, You heard everything. I didn't deny it. I asked him seriously, Thomas Lane, does my affection make you so uncomfortable? Was that why he had never considered coming to my home to propose? When friends teased him, he only dismissed it as bothersome. Everyone said the Smith family's daughter was deeply in love, but did my feelings embarrass him that much? His fingers stiffened, his eyes a mix of surprise and sorrow. That's not it. Everyone kept joking about it, and I did feel a bit annoyed. But later, when I heard you were in trouble in Jingzhou, I realized everything I used to value meant nothing. I disregarded everything and entered the palace to seek an audience with the emperor, just to get the chance to go to Jingzhou and find you. That day, you told me you and Victor Lane weren't unrelated, that the two of you had an engagement. But only I knew the truth, that the one once engaged to you was me. He looked at me in pain and confusion. Alan, that was the first time I realized I was wrong. The man I once loved for many years, even when I was covered in wounds, I never thought of giving up. Later, I fell into despair and let go. Now, he tells me he was wrong. But Thomas Lane. Broken is still broken. Does it hurt? Thomas Lane, in your youth, you didn't cherish love. Do you regret it now? Watching the one you love marry someone else. Does it make you ache too? My palms, pressed so hard they bled, the drops of blood mixed with the muddy earth, disappearing quickly. His lips trembled, the shattering and confusion in his eyes nearly consumed him. Thomas Lane's voice was hoarse. It hurts. I smiled, my eyes curving. Good. It's good that he hurts. At least he wasn't entirely heartless to me. At least it gives my past some closure. As for what's gone, let it stay in the past. I lifted my head and calmly told him, you don't need to overthink. I married Victor Lane not because of you. Before stepping into the carriage, I heard Thomas Lane ask, what if he dies? I didn't turn back. If he dies, I will remain chaste for him. No one is worth sacrificing myself for revenge. My life is still long. Even if Victor Lane dies, I have my own path to walk. My path will be steady, it will be good. I opened a shop in Jingzhou. I used the savings from the Smith family to start my business. Southern Liang values officials more than merchants, and some young ladies in the capital sneered at me. But I didn't care. I had witnessed the floods in Jingzhou, witnessed the plague that ravaged Jingzhou. I opened a rice shop, a pharmacy, and when Jingzhou prospered, I also ventured into cosmetics and jewelry. Later, those cosmetics and jewelry, under the Smith family brand, made their way to the capital. Gradually, the mocking laughter I once endured disappeared. The people of Jingzhou still remember me. The child who once had a fever and cried for their parents has now been adopted by a kind family. They recognized me, timidly stretched out their hand, and gave me a water caltrip. I held the water caltrip tightly, smiling as I bid the two farewell. When I turned back, the moonlight filled the sky, illuminating the night path beneath my feet. Leaning on my heart, leaning on the moonlight. During my days in Jingzhou, Victor Lane waited for me under the eaves, bathed in moonlight. The capital was full of schemers, he struggled to live there. Smiling, he said it was better to leave and become an official elsewhere. Life now, he thought, was good. So, I returned to Jingzhou. I walked under the moonlight, savoring the sweet water caltrip, retracing the old path back. At the end of the road, I saw someone. Tall and lean, holding a lantern, just like before. I stopped in my tracks. The person smiled, a hint of regret in their expression. I have nothing now. Coming to see you is truly presumptuous. My eyes suddenly stung, my voice hoarse. It's not presumptuous. Victor Lane explained that he couldn't escape Jingzhou that day. The townsfolk, whose lives he had once saved, risked everything to hide him when he was gravely injured. After being unconscious for several days, he awoke to learn I had safely returned to the capital. Only then did he fake his death to escape. The capital, rife with schemes, kept him bound as a blade in the emperor's hand, unable to free himself. He said he once wanted to find me, but the capital had far too many spies. All he could do was protect me silently along the way. I listened patiently as he recounted the dangers on the road. I asked him, "Then why are you coming to find me now?" Victor Lane rarely fell silent. His fingers curled slightly before he finally spoke after a moment, "There are too many suitors." Many sought the Smith family brand. Some admired me, while others, like Thomas Lane in the capital, waited quietly. Waiting. I said nothing, only smiled. Victor Lane hesitated briefly, his gaze softening as he raised the lantern in his hand. "Actually, the first time I met you, you were holding a lantern just like this." At that time, Victor Lane had lost his father and was staying with the Ta family. He was pushed into the water, drenched, with no one to help him. That night, I left him a lantern. I didn't remember this very well. I was young then, and many things I did were quickly forgotten. But I vaguely recalled seeing an old lantern in Victor Lane's storage. Victor Lane didn't continue. He brought the lantern closer, stood beside me, and together we walked the path home. No matter how far or long the night road stretched, he illuminated it clearly. I raised my hand and placed the water caltrip in his palm. When I came to Jingzhou, I often admired the moon here. His gaze flickered slightly. At that time, he waited for me under the eaves, in the moonlight. Even when the moon was absent, he never missed a meeting. I looked at Victor Lane and smiled. It's not about liking the moon. Love the one who lights the path, that's all. Just as the moon remains whole and bright, so are we now.